All right, well, welcome to the show. We're very excited to have our special guest, David Bruce, on today. David is originally from Oklahoma, but his story has a pivoting moment in Moscow, actually, where he became a Christ follower in the early 90s. A few years later, he met his wife, Cece, in Stockholm. They have two kids together, but after some time and kind of his own personal formation spiritually and dealing with some of his addiction issues, David embraced kind of the recovery aspect of his life, and so much so that he went to school to become a therapist. He actually is a licensed marriage and family therapist. He has been since 2008. He works in a clinical recovery program as well, working with addiction medicine. He's been doing that for 15 years. And then on top of that, him and his wife serve part-time in the ministry in Los Angeles. He specializes in chemical, behavioral addictions, depression, anxiety, and couples therapy. So he is a man of many talents, and hopefully is going to help us all fix ourselves and figure it all out. So David, good to have you here with us, and Christian.
Thank you, Elias.
Ways. So let's just jump into things. Maybe you could
Let's do it.
kind of give us a little bit of your spiritual journey and how you became, a therapist, and how your spiritual journey led you to even kind of entering into that field and that specialty.
Well, great question. It is a crazy story. Yes, like you mentioned, I'm from the middle of Oklahoma, the Bible Belt of the USA. But I think growing up in that context, I became a little cynical of Christianity. And it was actually, I went to the Soviet Union for the first time in 1988. And I was absolutely stunned by a country that seemed to have little, but also valued things in a different way than I was used to here in, plentiful America. I felt like people valued relationships and other things more than material things, simply because there wasn't a lot of material things. So that sort of like stirred my interest in, going back to Russia, living there. And then it was actually through Russian literature and reading guys like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky that I really started to develop my interest in the Bible again, started reading the Bible. I found out that reading the Bible doesn't necessarily make you change your life very much. And so in 91, when I moved to Moscow, after living there for about 4 or 5 months, I got invited to church and studied the Bible with some disciples there, and understood for the first time that the Bible can be more than just read, it can be lived out. And that was a transformative moment in my life. So I was going to stay in Moscow for about a year, and that turned into 9. Just after that, after getting met and becoming a Christ follower, I decided God probably had some bigger plans there in Russia. So so life was radically changed then, and then back in the late 90s, I started having just some real frustrations and disappointments in life. I wasn't feeling really good about myself or about what I was doing or my work, and actually, ironically, this is when I connected with Christian, and Christian just became an incredibly safe friend for me, who bore with me and loved me despite
Yes.
how miserable I felt about myself and many things around me. But and that's when some of my addiction issues actually started coming back. Sex and pornography were issues obviously before I became a Christian, but then just impurity just started coming back like a firestorm, and it was just it was getting pretty alarming. And then we ended up moving to LA, and when I got here, within a few months, a friend of mine that I met in the church was starting one of the first men's purity groups, and I thought, yeah, I probably should check that out. And when I did, I think that just really, for me, that was a second conversion. I think definitely baptism saves you, and it is a conversion moment. But I think I've learned since then that God has many, many conversions in store for us through things that we go through, things that we learn and discover. And I think probably one of the things that really transformed me in that moment was this very interesting phrase that I learned in recovery, which was emotions are a horrible master, but a great servant. And I think just the paradox of that statement just opened my eyes and I think expanded my faith in a remarkable way. Because I'm an only child, so I think I learned growing up, when you feel stuff, if you can just hide it or ignore it, things eventually will be okay. But things didn't eventually become okay by doing that.
Yeah.
And so I often felt mastered by how I felt all the time, even though all of it was going on inside.
Yeah.
And so I think in recovery, I just learned that, wow, wait a minute. When you actually figure out what you feel and you can actually listen to it and pay attention to it and then express it, something pretty magical and transformative happens. And then that opened my eyes to what I've been reading in the Psalms for years. Here's David, kind of knows what he feels and pretty much communicates anything and everything that he feels. And he seems to imply that God is pretty down to listening to whatever you're going through and how you feel about what you're going through.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where I just started realizing, wow, I've been sort of emotionally stiff or numb for too long. And yeah, it was like my Christian walk turned into color. It went from color from black and white. And it's been quite a ride ever since. So
I love that. Yeah, I had a very similar experience. Like after becoming a follower of Christ, and then a few years down the road went through a recovery program, and they had 5 emotions: mad, sad, glad, afraid, and embarrassed. And that was the first time I ever identified emotions other than I'm happy or I feel a little weird,
right.
I'm in my mid-20s and I'm identifying, and then it really did transform how I related to people and to God, to be able to be in touch with some of those things and then communicate some of those things. I loved what you said. Maybe you could unpack that statement a little bit for us, that emotions make great servants but horrible masters.
Yeah, that well, first of all, let me go back. Growing up, I definitely had my experience of many people around me who it seemed their emotions mastered them. I had certain adult caregivers whose anger was sometimes rather intense, and I remember paying attention to that as a kid, just going, "Gosh, I hate the way I feel around this person who's very angry." And I think as a young person growing up, feeling that awful feeling, I ended up making sort of the wrong conclusions that, man, anger is obviously a problem. And so let me try to do my best to never, ever be angry. So, I became a very artificial person. If I was angry, I just convinced myself I wasn't, or said things or did things to imply that I wasn't. And, here I am trying to not let anger master me, but at the same time, I was not allowing it to be a servant. I wasn't allowing it to inform me of, when I'm a little frustrated, that may mean I need to talk about a boundary, or I need to identify something that's not so helpful that's coming into this interaction or this relationship. So, yeah, I think... just the experience of emotions mastering others definitely gave me some red flags, but it didn't help me understand that emotions can also be helpful. Like, can anger actually be a good thing? Can that be a benefit? Can sadness be a beneficial thing? And, the more and more I look through scriptures and especially the Psalms, Lamentations, grief is a really good thing. It is a process that's supposed to guide us through something. And so even though it may be uncomfortable, just because something is uncomfortable does not mean that it is not beneficial. And I think that's what I started realizing, is that all these weird things that I feel, they're not bad news. It's just something I need to pay attention to and be still and connect with God about those things.
So I have a question. I remember you when you were young and everything was black and white.
Long time ago.
You were a slave to your emotions. I'm just kidding, actually. None of those things were self-evident at the time that I knew you in Moscow, when we used to hang out a lot. But I guess the question is this. there's so many of us have that sort of that limitation that it seems it can become a very easy disillusionment with even the Bible and Christianity as a whole, right?
Yeah.
Where you go,
Right.
okay, I'm supposed to have this new life, and I don't feel renewed. I
Mm.
feel that I'm governed by my emotions or by some sort of addiction.
Right.
And I'm sincere. You are, I mean, one of the most sincere people I know, and I've love being friends with you forever, right? So,
Mhm.
so even from the outside in, I remember like I wouldn't be able to know that there's something fundamentally lacking in your journey. And I
Mm.
think many people will probably encounter themselves in that space of inwardly having all kinds of sort of insufficiencies, right? Limitations.
Sure.
Outwardly, you can be a servant, a friend, a beloved member of a community, which you are, which you were, in our
Right.
space, for example, we served together in the same
Yeah.
ministry. Um, and then, so I mean, the two roads that I see is one is, okay, well, outwardly, I'm accepted. I feel good. I have a lot of friends. I'm respected. I'm just going to sort of continue behavior modifications mode and sort of settle for it, right? Settle for a better than before, but still in an insufficient or falling short from the promises of God journey. And you can do
Yeah.
that for a while. You can white knuckle it for a while. But then how do you push through the discomfort, perhaps even the shame of really allowing your inward limitations be displayed to a safe space? How do you find mentors? How do you find the courage? How do you navigate your way out and basically not settle? I mean, and I'm sure there's thousands and thousands of people who have found themselves in that sort of space that they feel stuck and they don't want to leave Christianity or the church, but they also feel intensely unhappy and unsatisfied, right?
Yeah. Well, it's funny you mentioned that because that history you just mentioned, Christian, was definitely an interesting one. Because when you and I were doing ministry together, you're right. In one sense, it was the most remarkable season of my life in terms of ministry, and studying the Bible with people and seeing lots of transformed lives around my life. I mean, that definitely was a peak of my Christian life from one perspective. But like you said, little did people know that going on inside of me was this complete shutdown and nightmare. I mean, I was really concerned. Man, if I stay on this path, yeah, everything's looking good around me, but I think I'm going to decay internally. I'm gonna get worse, or I'm gonna become some horrible pervert, and I'll get kicked out of the church or something like that. I mean, I had some real concerns, but I think the term that has really spoken to me lately that I think clarified what you're describing is someone used this term the other day called Churchianity, which is where church provides a place where you can share a set of beliefs with other people. You can also share a form of belonging, because we're together, we come together, we do things together, that kind of stuff. But then transformation is optional. And I think
Right.
that really spoke to that season of my life, that I had a huge sense of belonging. Man, people loved me and I loved them. Had really clear set of beliefs that I share with people. God is it and Jesus is Lord. I agreed with all that stuff. But this whole thing about transformation, I was not figuring out. And I would say the thing, what Fred Rogers said this, Mr. Rogers is a very wise man, or was. He said, emotions that are mentionable are manageable. And I think that's really what has changed is I've started to create a church space where I have a number of individuals that I can mention whatever it is I may be feeling, and then I can begin to manage it better. And then I think also, again, the model of the Psalms, I think David is modeling that it is okay to mention anything that you feel, even violent, even aggressive, even depressing thoughts are okay to mention to God, because emotions are relational. And if I don't mention or connect with you in terms of how I feel about stuff, it's less likely that I'm going to be really connecting with you. And I think that's where, especially in the Christian world, I think one problem with Christianity sometimes is that it is a target-rich environment for developing codependency patterns, which is, if you bring up a negative emotion that's uncomfortable, let me do my best to fix that right away so that you don't feel uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And I think that can be very problematic. I think someone said that if you could summarize good parenting in a single word — this is a neuroscientist from UCLA, Daniel Siegel, who studied thousands of families and thousands of good, bad, and ugly ways about how kids have been raised by their parents. But he said, if I could summarize good parenting in one single word, it would be the word presence. Interesting. Not your social status, not how materially successful you are or how much you provide for your kids, but just the word presence. And I think that is exactly what God provides everyone. You know, perhaps we'll reach out to him because he is not far from each one of us. His presence is pretty amazing. And I think the more I've learned the value of God's presence, I've realized how important it is just to be present with someone when they're going through a hard time. And I don't offer a bunch of answers, but just to be present with someone, that kind of safety, I think is incredibly transformative. But I think we do, especially in our Western world, we're so uncomfortable with quote unquote negative emotions that I used to fix them by going to an addictive behavior, or some people go to a chemical to deal with that negative feeling. But to actually lean in and allow our emotions to become a way of connecting better with God, better with one another, and to gain some direction from our emotions. Because the root word of emotions is motare, Latin, which literally means to move. You know, don't mess up this uncomfortable emotion, because it may be moving me in a direction that I need to go.
Okay, so here's a question that I think is a practical question for many of us, right? So 2020, there's a lot of emotions. 2021, we're still feeling a lot of emotions, right? And there's, you know, everybody knows this word triggered now, right? Like, I'm triggered, you're triggered, I'm triggered by the fact that you said triggered. Like, everybody's triggered by something, and we're feeling these emotions, and we're feeling them with the people that we're in community with, like our church or our family or our workplace. And those negative emotions come up, right? And you talked about kind of a codependence in how we deal with emotions. How do we process our emotions when triggered like that in with other people in a way that's still effective, right? Because you're talking about being present, being open, being vulnerable, with kind of transparent with what's inside. You know, you're sharing that with other people. How does that work? Because maybe what I share with somebody is going to trigger something in them, and then they're going to respond. So how do we have a healthy environment where we can be present with each other, share those things, process all that we're processing, and still not turn against each other, or not kind of fold to the codependent interaction?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that word environment, because I think the first environment that we got to take care of is the one right here. And I'll say this, when we get triggered, thanks for bringing up that word, by the way. When we get triggered and we have a negative emotional response to something we hear or read or watch on social media, whatever, when we have a negative feeling in response to that, one way that we deal with our negative feelings is we distract ourselves with thoughts. In other words, I don't like how I feel, so now I start thinking more and more and more, and I think of a lot of thoughts, trying to somehow like move myself away from that feeling or distract myself from that feeling. And guess what? Now I have a flood of thoughts which means now my environment here in my head is way off balanced. Actually, I brought my brain here to kind of exemplify this stuff. So if you can see the brain here, all of our emotions come from this central area of the limbic system, right? And our rational, even our more spiritual brain or area of our brain, the rational part, is the prefrontal cortex right here in the front. And the thing is, our brain has only so much energy at one point. So if my limbic system is hot, I'm really, really mad. Well, my rational brain is going to be deprived of energy, and it's going to be a little dull, which means I'm going to be very irrational if I'm really, really angry, and now I'm having 1,000 thoughts all connected to that anger. So one way that I've learned that helps to regulate this really well is to learn to think less and just be present with how you feel, to have some curiosity about how you feel rather than reacting to how you feel. And one mechanism, and it's hard for guys to hear this, but one of the things that I've done for many years now is just that whole process of journaling. When I've got 1,000 thoughts in my head, half of them probably don't make sense, but it's all swirling. And as soon as the one makes sense, I grab 3 more that don't make sense, and it's just a jungle there. But when you're writing out your thoughts, and it's interesting that God chose a written word to communicate, writing things down, you can't go too crazy. I can't write 15 thoughts at one point, but just slowing down to actually write what I think or what I feel about a situation typically balances out those 2 areas of the brain. It's, in other words, the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex actually kind of work together when you're actually journaling and putting things into concrete terms. But man, when we're not doing that stuff, my brain is on fire, and now I'm reacting to people around me rather than responding to them.
So can I ask you this for guys? You said it's sort of, guys don't like to journal. It's true, right? I think women are tend to be more naturally connected to their emotions.
Sure.
Okay, what's a hack? What's a hack for a guy who just hates what you just said but wants to change?
The life hack for dudes. Okay. So I, like I said, when we don't feel comfortable, we go to excessive thinking, which can often be less helpful. And we sort of flood ourselves with our own thoughts. So one hack that I've used for years now is turn whatever you're going into or whatever you're experiencing into a 3 to 5 word story. Okay. So, if someone's having a bad day or whatever, I just say, okay, can you tell me the story of your bad day in like 3 or 5 random words? Now, think about that. All of a sudden, I've got this mess in my head. I hate 15 things that happened at work today, but now I'm trying to contain and put that whole experience into 3 to 5 random words. Okay? So then after that person is written down, or I write down these 3 or 5 words that summarize the conversation that I just had or the week that I've had, now we just kind of flesh out think all of those words or a couple of those words. So, I had a guy the other day talked about, he said, I think I'll probably make up half of it, but it was something like frustrated, intrigued, and done. Those are 3 interesting words, but then we talked about each of those words, and then suddenly he is explaining and processing this situation in a much more contained, grounded, and authentic way. Because, by the way, if somebody gives me 3 or 5 random words that are all positive, happy, cool, excited, wonderful, amazing, I can't relate very much to that. And I don't even know how real honest that is, because I don't think life is ever all positive. But I think that's one hack that I've learned that has been really, it's actually fun sometimes. Like I've done this exercise. Tell me the 5-word story of your life before you became a Christian. Write down those 5 words. And then tell me 5 random words that tell the story of being a Christian today. And just look at the difference in those 2 words. I mean, that is a great conversation starter right there, just to listen to somebody, flesh out maybe those 5-word stories. But I think that's a really helpful hack that keeps the brain contained and balanced when we're going. And I even think you could do this in the future. Like if you have an event coming up that you're not looking forward to, or a tough conversation, okay, well, give me 3 random words that you would love to use to describe that conversation if it goes reasonably well. And then, maybe the words are honest, grounded, and clear. Okay, well now give me an idea or a behavior or a decision that you're going to do that's going to help fulfill each of those 3 words. So now you have action and behavior attached to maybe that word you're going to be going for to influence how that interaction goes or that situation.
It's great. Those are great practicals. Okay, so I'm going to ask a kind of a specific, nuanced question. Maybe it's not so nuanced. I don't know. So in that practice, right? You're triggered by something. You're feeling something. Okay, I'm gonna put it into some words. I'm gonna have a conversation with another person about those words to kind of process it, right? How do you safeguard against just living in your own echo chamber? And what I mean is, we kind of already have that set up, right? Our algorithms on our social media pages and everything that we're listening to, we kind of live in the echo chamber of our opinion, and everybody in that echo chamber is triggered by the same things. And maybe our closest friends in our community, in our church, or in our workplace, or our school, we're all kind of triggered by the same things. And so now I go to process this with somebody, and they go, "Yeah, you're right, man." Like and they just kind of feed into this. Now there's this feedback loop that's actually affirming all these things rather than helping me process it in a way that's differentiated from what I might think, that's offering an objective perspective. I think that's available to many people, but there's a bridge to cross to kind of have that conversation with somebody who probably doesn't share the same feelings or triggers, or how do we make sure that we're getting healthy feedback and perspective, and we're kind of living in reality and not just in an echo chamber of everything that we are already believing.
Yeah, I love the other extreme that we're talking about, because codependency is where we're fixing each other. But what I think you just described is how we seem to be rallying one another. And I think you're right. That can be a very dangerous game where this goes back to that sense of belonging. I'm really mad about what that politician did. Aren't you mad about what that politician did? And yes, I'm mad. And now we're elevating that limbic system, and now we've got group reaction,
right?
As opposed to maybe, I like the word trigger again. I think I can have a sense of belonging because we're all being triggered together in the same way. And I don't think that's really. If I go down the fruits of the Holy Spirit, I don't necessarily see a lot of those when I've got people just aligning with my triggering reaction to something. Not a lot of calm, not a lot of gentleness or kindness or love. And I think that's where I do think being still with how you feel and being curious about how we feel, as opposed to just reacting with how we feel. One acronym that I found this year, this is from some neurotheologians those are my people, man. They study the brain and they look at how the Bible really supports good brain healthy functioning. And this acronym was CAKE, C-A-K-E. And the idea is that when someone triggers you, number one, be curious about what they are saying. Okay, remain curious, kind of keep a little more open-minded as opposed to just slapping labels on it or whatever. To be curious. A, appreciate. So find something good about that human being, maybe even if just it's in the eyes of God. How does God see that person? What are valuable things about that person that I can appreciate, even though I may not like something they're saying or doing? And then K is kindness. What is something that I can say or do that would make this person feel loved regardless of how I think about their, political opinion or whatever. And then E is embrace. And what that means is, can I embrace that if I can believe that this relationship, our dynamic, can actually be better, healthier, and closer on the other side of this conflict that we are having. Just those 4 steps, to me, initiate neurochemistry in our head that is much healthier, and I think creates a very interesting pathway to follow the Holy Spirit, much more likely, because when we're triggered, cortisol is probably the number one brain chemistry that's going on, the stress hormone, cortisol. Curiosity is actually a very different neurochemical. It's really rooted in dopamine, which is, what am I about to discover? What am I about to learn? What is about to become more apparent? And those are 2 very different mindsets. And I was just in a class yesterday where someone explained that the issue with that word triggered is that when I say you triggered me, or that article triggered me, it really allows me to put myself in a very comfortable victim position. You did that to me. You triggered me. And this brother kind of transformed it a little bit. What if instead of triggered, we understood that as resistance? Meaning, when I'm triggered, is my reaction just a way of resisting what the Holy Spirit may be wanting to teach or help me understand, rather than just being mad and triggered and suspicious of what someone has said or what someone has written? And I find that very interesting. And I took that really to heart, because I realized so many things that I get triggered by, I get really energized by my anger or my indignation about what this person said. And I've thrown curiosity out the window. And there's no prospect of fruits of the Holy Spirit showing up in that interaction.
So what you're saying is, when we're triggered, we all just need a little bit of cake. Is that right?
We need a piece of cake. Yes.
I think you're hearing that. You're reading into that.
That's what I'd like to
do. Yeah. I think your desire for dopamine that comes from carbs is now kicking in.
Carbs and sugar.
That's it. That's it.
That's some brain chemistry right there.
That's right. It just kicked in. You got triggered when we started talking about cake. So I love that, because it puts the onus on me. Say I'm triggered by something. It puts the onus on me to become curious. And I think that's being curious and asking questions is like part science and part art form and a lot of relational wisdom. How do we get better at just that practice? Like moving from kind of the victim triggered space to, okay, let me be curious about this. What kind of questions should we even be asking? How should we endeavor into that?
First of all, that's the right direction to go. Questions. I find really helpful questions to be a great way to sort of invite the brain to go down a different path. So when I'm triggered by something, what is it that I may not fully know about that person or that group that I need to keep in mind? Okay, so what do I not know or understand yet? That's a good question. Also, what is it that has perhaps influenced that person to reach that position or that point of view? What types of things influenced that person that I may never know or understand? So in other words, instead of being so locked into what a person did or said, to sort of get into a bigger, more open-minded perspective on that person. I'll give you one example. I know there's been a lot of energy and tension around the Black Lives Matter movement. But I was having this conversation with my son a few months ago, and I guess it was at his church service, they were talking about it. And I think the minister said, Black Lives Matter, we can look at it as a political movement, but if you just take those three words, it's also a lament. It's a lament. And I think this goes to a whole different ballgame, is when we don't grieve properly, we are going to get overwhelmed with anger, or we're going to get shut down by overwhelming sadness. And I think lament is a very tender balance of those two emotions. When you feel mad and sad, you feel hurt. And again, this goes back to what is mentionable is manageable. So if I can mention to someone what really made me sad or what really made me mad about something, chances are I'm going to be able to lament now with that person, or someone can lament with me if I can just have a conversation to talk about that. But when we don't do that, I think that's when, political things can get really unhelpful. And it just seems like a mad, a mob of angry people. Well, hold on. Let me contain that a little bit. What is the lament going on here? What is maybe a hurt or a part of that person's story that I may not know yet or I haven't heard yet?
And I imagine that's the bridge, right? It's the empathy. It's the connection of let me understand beyond the trigger words or beyond the thing that I feel attacked by, or whatever that is. Let me understand what's this person feeling? How are they thinking about it? How did they come to understand it? How have they processing it emotionally? How does that make you feel? Those kind of questions what you're really after is connection, right? Some
Exactly. And let me balance that out, because I taught this when we were going through some of our social justice lessons here in Turning Point. Just as I just said, Black Lives Matter is a lament. Well, guess what? Make America Great Again is also a lament. For some, again, this is where we've got to be able to transcend our thinking above political lines and really see where's the way that I can connect, have empathy and compassion, whatever a person's political view might be or opinion about something. And I think Brene Brown she defined compassion. This is so good. She defined compassion looking at its original Latin roots, which literally means to suffer with.
Yeah.
Right? So, God is the God of compassion and comfort. We really like the comfort part. Like, God, give me comfort, give me relief. But hold on, he's also the God of compassion, which means when I think I'm being triggered, maybe it's me resisting God suffering with me. And is God still real, even though I may be feeling really uncomfortable or really hurt by something? Man, I want to have I want to know that God has compassion for me, that he wants to suffer with me. And when I experience that with him, I think I have a much more likelihood to have compassion with, my brother, my sister, my coworkers who may think radically different than I do about certain issues.
So I love that you sort of paint that picture of Black Lives Matter. It's a lament. Make America Great is a lament. I think you're absolutely right about that. It is a primal cry. That's why it resonates with people, right?
Yeah.
And that's why it also moves people emotionally so strongly, and so many of them, right? So these are two laments, and they're not actually necessarily at all competing laments, but they're laments that sort of rose to the top of the national conversation.
Right.
And yet at the same time, as anything that is sort of encompasses such a range of emotions of what that means to each individual person, it also turns into, political things that we might not align with, right?
Right.
So you might not align with Make America Great Again on also so many different levels. And you want to respect the feeling, the real authentic thing that arises in people's hearts. The same thing with BLM. So you have to, let's say you have a hypothetical to people who are, I wouldn't even say these are polar things like BLM and America Great Again. They just happen to be big ones, right? I don't think
Right.
they're necessarily sort of one against the other at all, actually,
Right.
but they were adopted by different sides, et cetera, et cetera. So it makes it a bit more polarizing. Now, I imagine in Los Angeles, as it is in Austin, as it is in Oklahoma, as it is in other places in the United States where the American conversation is taking place, you identify there's a tribal affinity that starts happening, right? And the problem with that, I think, is that as our affinity needs to be to the kingdom, this other affinity starts invading the kingdom affinity, right? This affiliation. So, so a very practical question is, what is the place for individual conversations, personal conversations? How do you communicate? Hey, I feel the compassion. I want to suffer with you in this thing that hurts, that pains you, right? But I don't want to. I'm not. I don't have the political affinity. And is that okay? How do you communicate that? Because that's, I think, the idea of curiosity sort of feeds into that, I think, as well. Because, like one of the things that we talk about is like when I teach, I say, if you're naturally trending in one direction, which all of us have a natural bend of one, or our origin story, cultural story, all of that influences the natural bend.
Right.
And if you lean that way, instead of just immersing yourself in people who feel the same way, subscribe to a couple podcasts that think the opposite. Read a couple of books. But that's not a natural thing to do, I think, for people. I think it's much easier to agree with the people who agree with you and then sort of preach to the choir on Facebook and vent. And that creates cracks in the kingdom, sort of, So what are maybe like 2 or 3 practical things that you think in your work you've seen help people sort of keep the kingdom at the center, and then without really dismissing or minimizing some of that primal deep sorrow and lament that can take one form or another?
Yeah. I would say first of all, I do agree. We have to be very careful when we start trying to have macro conversations about anything. I do think there is more power and more transformation when we are able to do this at the micro level. I can't have a conversation with a country. I'm not in that position. I can't have a conversation with 1,000 people. But man, every time I have a conversation with 1 or 2 or 3 people, my ability to remain curious without being flooded or without starting to feel trapped into an identity or some other group behind me, I think that is extremely important. And then the other rule that I use probably in every group, including at my clinic, one rule that we follow very adamantly, which has actually been hard to do with Christians actually, is speaking from an I, me, and my. Speak from your own personal perspective and experience. As soon as I start talking about us or we or they, I'm now no longer moving toward genuine belonging, right? Because like I said, we're designed for belonging, but we sometimes want it so badly, we will subscribe to false forms of belonging. So
Yeah, of course.
gathering 1,000 people that all agree with me and all hate the same thing, well, it kind of looks like belonging, but it's really not. We're just riled up about something and we're all scared of something. And I just don't think that's the type of belonging that transforms the world and transforms people. I think it's having more intimate, one on one conversations, sticking with I, me, and my, and also understanding the value of intimacy. And the way I define intimacy is when I'm having a conversation, I am I am knowing someone and being known at the same time. If that is achieved in a conversation, I think then you have connection. And it's no longer about tribes and groups and political opinions and all that other stuff. I think that is the more human connection. So sticking with I, me, and my, um, well, let's take James. Be quick to listen, slow to speak. Making sure that what I'll often do is I'll actively listen to people. I mean, I do this all the time in therapy, but when someone says something, say back to them what you just heard them say. Like, I just heard you say that you've lived in this country, for 40 years, and every time you get pulled over, you get asked if you have any warrants for your arrest. Wow. Brother, I've never heard that about you. And it is shocking for me to hear that. And I've not had that experience ever. I mean, I literally had this talk just last week with a brother. I mean, I've known this brother for 5 or 6 years, and I never knew that about his life. But I just repeated back to him, so what I just heard you say was this. Wow. You know what I mean? I mean, that was a very tender moment with that brother, But I think that's how we do. We actively listen and speak for my, me, and my.
So how do you then? I mean, that's a very that's a lot of emotional labor, right? So, right, if you think about it, it's much easier to just express hurt and shortcut all of that stuff.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's much easier to vent on Facebook or just to go to a place where everybody's sort of saying the same thing anyway, or speaking to each other. Yeah. Yeah. Now, how does that look like on a again, taking it to the me level, right?
Yeah.
So it's okay. I hear somebody saying something in my community, in my church, at my workplace. Does it mean you go, look, is the upside of this worth it for me? And I go, hey, can I grab a coffee with you? Is that what you're advising? And obviously you can't do that at scale, but you can do that quite a bit if you put your mind to it.
Yeah. Well, I would say it goes back to that definition of intimacy. What am I going for? Do I want to be agreed with, or do I want to be connected with? And I think this is kind of what Elias was saying earlier. If I just want to be agreed with, I don't need to grab a cup of coffee with anybody. I can go to Facebook, social media, whatever. But again, I think God has made us for connection, not conformity. And connection does happen, I think, at that more micro level where, vulnerability is never easy. I admire vulnerability, but every time I do it, it's a little uncomfortable. But I've learned that discomfort is often growth trying to happen. And that is a very difficult thing to say in the United States of America, where we don't elevate discomfort very much. We're about the pursuit of happiness, and all that good stuff. But I just think, when I read the Bible and I look at Jesus's life, it wasn't a happy life. It was a full life, right? But it was also many moments of discomfort where God was apparently growing Jesus through discomforts that he went through. And I'm starting to believe that, the more curious I can be about my own discomfort, as well as discomforts of others, I actually may now be a part of their growth process,
It's great.
as opposed to, did I just get another guy on my team?
Right.
What team? What
Right.
team are we on?
Right.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
fantastic.
And you know, God created us, didn't want us to be happy, but He created us to be holy. There's nowhere in the Bible does it say you're gonna pursue your happiness and it's gonna be given to you.
Right.
Yeah,
Not on this side of heaven, I don't think, right?
Yeah.
that's
That
right.
was never a promise. That was never a promise. That got added along the way, because we like to
Yeah,
add it along the way.
yeah,
Holiness is it's a more painful process, right?
yeah.
More intimate, more personal. So, but let me ask you this. So, I wrestle with this idea a lot, right? So, curiosity begets curiosity, begets curiosity, begets curiosity. There's a cycle there. The more curious you are, the more sort of change you see and growth you see, and then you become curious more readily because you've already seen it work.
Right.
Now, the other side of the spectrum, where you're even brain chemistry, right, is you are stressed, you buy into the victim mentality because there is actually a lot of comfort in the victim mentality. You have to take responsibility. You're safe, in another strange way, but you are.
Yeah,
Um, you are a victim. You are triggered. You're in a triggered mode. That begets more triggered modes and more because you start seeing the triggered in yourself, in other things, in other people. You start associating with triggered people. Like I see that, and it's a major dilemma. It's a major sort of riddle for me and puzzle for me. I puzzle about that. I go, I mean, it's clear. It's not uncomplicated. And yet it's incredibly hard to move someone from a triggered space, especially if that's a prolonged triggered space, to a curious space. And
yeah.
what is that? What is that? What is the process? What are some of the things that you can do to wake somebody to another possibility, which is very uncomfortable, and the transition is probably painful, right?
Yeah. Well, when you say that triggered state, you're right. It is, when I'm in a triggered state, I'm no longer trying to thrive. I'm just trying to survive. And you're right. That survival instinct, unfortunately, is very irrational. It's very difficult to work against or work with. I would say one idea, Christian, to that point, I'll borrow from couples therapy. I will never know whether a person's brain is too triggered or really ready for a conversation. So one skill that I've given couples is never assume both brains are ready for the conversation. So make an appointment. Make an appointment. So, bro, I heard you mention something the other day, at church, and it kind of bothered me, and I don't think I fully understood it. When would be a good time for you and I to just have a conversation about XY issue? Okay. By me asking that question for an appointment, I'm actually inviting the other person to do his own inventory, or we'll call it brain inventory. Like, okay, what would I have to do to get safe or to get grounded enough to just have a conversation with David about what I said last week at church? Okay, so I just think, when we're not caught off guard, or especially if we're not reacting to something, I think being more intentional and setting up sort of a level ground for both people's feet in a conversation, that I think allows for a less triggered dynamic. But again, this is the hardest part about the prefrontal cortex to follow, which is being intentional.
Yeah.
Making a decision to set up this kind of conversation or this kind of connection with somebody, not winging it.
Well, David, This has been fascinating and extremely practical. I feel like we need to, I mean, we've been going for an hour. I feel like we need to have a part two at some point.
Oh, wow.
There's just, you're providing so many nuggets here. I think we could just keep talking, honestly.
Oh, amen. I hope so.
Yeah, but for people who want to know more, who want to learn more, who maybe want to get in touch with you or stuff that you're working on or you're producing, how can they go about that? Where can people find more?
Well, I'm a very simple man, and I've got many hats, but I would say, I've not come up with my blog or my website yet, but just emailing me would probably be a great way to just start a connection. So counseling@davidabruce.com is the best way to get a hold of me.
Okay. Christian, maybe you can help him out here, man. Maybe you can help him get a
man.
Go in for an old friend.
We should spread the word, man. David Bruce, my old friend.
There we go.
I love you, man. Yeah, I'm so proud of you and grateful for your work. And you're a remarkable human being. I'm just happy to be friends with you.
Oh, same here, brother. Love you much. Admire you so much. Thank you, friend.
Thanks so much, David.
Awesome. Elias, thank you, brother, so much. It's I know you and I are a newer friendship, but man, I love connecting with you and so appreciate just a few moments we've had to talk. So thank you.
Look forward to more. Thanks for being on the show.
Awesome. Same here.